Imagine standing on a sun-scorched plain in 1177, surrounded not by an army, but by certainty of death. Before you stretch 26,000 seasoned warriors, an ocean of steel, banners, and dust, while beside you stand barely 500 exhausted knights, who can hardly keep their horses upright. Logic says this moment should mark the end of a kingdom. History should record a swift, predictable massacre, but instead something else happened. Within hours, one of the most lopsided battles the medieval world had ever seen flipped itself inside out, reshaping the fate of the Crusader states, fracturing Saladin's rising empire, and elevating a dying teenage king into legend. How did this impossible victory unfold? What crack in the world allowed 500 men to break 26,000? Let's peel back the layers of myth and stand in the dust of that afternoon. Before we dive deeper, hit like if you love history that feels stranger than fiction. Subscribe for more cinematic deep dives, and drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. It helps shape what stories we explore next. In the autumn of 1177, the Kingdom of Jerusalem felt less like a realm than a dying flame flickering in the cold winds of inevitability. For decades, the Crusader states had survived through a fragile balance of military grit, political marriages, lucky storms, and the occasional intervention of European nobles who still cared enough to send reinforcements. But by the late 12th century, that balance was tilting hard and terrifyingly in one direction. Saladin, the sultan whose ambitions stretched from Egypt to Syria, had unified lands that had spent generations fracturing themselves through civil wars, rival dynasties, and shifting allegiances. Now, those once distant powers moved as a single organism, breathing, marching, and fighting under a leader whose victories were beginning to look effortless. Muslim chroniclers admired him, Christian chroniclers feared him, and in the fortified cities of the Crusader states, whispers spread like a sickness. If Saladin truly wanted to erase Jerusalem from the map, could anything stop him? Jerusalem's defenses were thin, fresh knights were scarce, and the nobles bickered over succession, taxes, and trade routes. Even the Templars and Hospitallers, usually the backbone of defense, were stretched across too many borders, too many garrisons, and too many patrol routes. The kingdom was bracing itself for a storm it knew it couldn't withstand, and yet no one dared say it aloud. At the center of this fragile world stood a king who should never have lived long enough to wear a crown. Baldwin IV, the boy most thought doomed to die quietly in a palace chamber, was now 16, thin as parchment, wrapped in silk bandages to hide the damage leprosy had carved into his hands. His illness was not a rumor. It was visible, undeniable, and impossible to ignore. He wore gloves not out of vanity, but survival. He rode a horse not because it was comfortable, but because his people needed to see him upright, regal, defiant, behind a silver mask that protected his disfigured face. Baldwin projected a calm authority that startled foreign diplomats. They expected a ghost. They met a commander, and yet beneath the ceremony lay a kingdom terrified that its ruler might not survive the year. Physicians whispered predictions they dared not write down. His advisors argued over regency, alliances, succession rights, all while Saladin assembled the largest force the region had seen since the First Crusade. A force so overwhelming that even seasoned generals doubted Jerusalem could raise enough men to delay him, let alone stop him. The truth was harsh, mathematical, and uncomfortably simple. The Crusader states were outnumbered, outfunded, and outmaneuvered. And yet, in the weeks leading to Montgisard, something strange began to happen, not in Saladin's camp, but in Baldwin's. The young king, barely able to feel his own fingers, made decisions that senior commanders wouldn't have dared. He pushed back against council urging evacuation. He insisted on confronting the threat head-on. And in those moments, something shifted in the hearts of the knights around him. A dying king was preparing to fight a living legend, and for reasons even they couldn't fully explain. They believed he might just win. Long before Baldwin IV became a symbol of defiant leadership, he was simply a curious boy in the royal court, one who loved horses, excelled in military exercises, and showed a sharp political instinct far beyond his age. But his childhood took a turn that would define not only his life, but the fate of an entire kingdom. When he was around 9 years old, his tutor, the future historian William of Tyre, noticed something odd. Baldwin didn't react to pain. One afternoon, while wrestling with other boys, he was gouged so deeply that flesh tore. Yet he didn't flinch. That moment, small and chilling, was the first undeniable sign of leprosy. In a world where disease often carried as much social power as a sword, leprosy was a slow, merciless curse. It isolated, disfigured, and often banished its victims to the outskirts of society. But Baldwin was no ordinary child, and Jerusalem was no ordinary kingdom. Instead of hiding him away, the court doubled down on training him, teaching him statecraft, exposing him to council meetings, and surrounding him with knights who hoped, perhaps irrationally, that determination could slow the disease's march. Yet, as Baldwin entered adolescence, his condition worsened. His hands grew numb. His face required coverings. His joints stiffened. Physicians predicted he would not live to see 16, much less reign. And when he did ascend the throne at 13, even his allies wondered whether crowning a dying boy was an act of faith or desperation. The paradox was brutal, but true. Baldwin's weakness forced him to become stronger, faster than any king before him. And it was precisely that paradox, the king who could barely feel his fingers, but could still command armies, that began reshaping how his knights saw him. Baldwin's leprosy didn't diminish his authority, it magnified it. When nobles whispered doubts, he spoke with a clarity that silenced them. When critics feared he lacked stamina, he rode at the head of campaigns, enduring pain so intense that knights sometimes found blood seeping through his gloves. People expected fear from him. Instead, he displayed a level of composure that unnerved even Saladin's envoys. Chroniclers remarked that the disease seemed to carve away everything unnecessary, leaving behind someone who didn't cling to life for comfort, but wielded it like a weapon. Baldwin's looming mortality made him bold and, at times, frighteningly unpredictable. He had no luxury of decades-long strategy. Every choice was immediate, urgent, sharpened by the knowledge that tomorrow was never guaranteed. And because of that, His soldiers believed in him with a fervor rarely seen in medieval warfare. A king who fought through agony inspired men to push past exhaustion. A king who lived on borrowed time convinced them that the impossible might just be possible. Baldwin's affliction didn't cripple his rule. It forged its core. And as word spread that Saladin was marching north with an army the size of a moving city, many expected the young king to retreat, negotiate, or hide behind Jerusalem's walls. Instead, Baldwin prepared to ride straight toward the storm. The boy destined to die quietly was about to alter the course of history more profoundly than rulers, with lifetimes of health and power, and every man around him sensed it. This was not the story of a king surviving his disease, but a king using it. To understand why the Battle of Montgisard shocked the medieval world, you first have to step into Saladin's mindset in 1177, a moment when his powers seemed not only unstoppable, but divinely affirmed. For years, he had been stitching together a patchwork of fractured territories: Egypt, Damascus, Aleppo, Mosul. Lands that had once fought each other now marched under a single banner, unified not just by politics, but by Saladin's reputation as both a warrior and a pious reformer. His armies were veterans of siege after siege, victory after victory, battles where Christian fortresses fell like dominoes. And when scouts reported that the Crusader states were undermanned, fractured by rival nobles, and led by a teenage king whose body was literally decaying, Saladin saw the perfect moment to strike. His plan was bold but simple: bypass the powerful fortress of Ascalon, sweep north, seize Jerusalem before winter, and end the Crusader presence in the Holy Land forever. He wasn't marching to fight. He was marching to inherit what he believed was already his. With him traveled 26,000 soldiers, elite cavalry, tribal levies, supply caravans, engineers, and even his treasury, a sign he expected occupation, not resistance. Chroniclers note his army moved with the confidence of men certain they were instruments of destiny. And why wouldn't they? Nothing in recent memory had contradicted that belief. Every calculation, politically and militarily, pointed toward an effortless conquest. Even Jerusalem's own nobles believed Saladin's triumph was inevitable, with some preparing evacuation routes before the first sword was drawn. The Sultan wasn't just expecting victory. He was expecting a victory so complete that it would reshape the map of the Middle East. But hidden within the brilliance of his strategy was a single flaw, one so small and so understandable that no general of the era would have questioned it. Saladin assumed the Crusader states would respond rationally. He expected them to defend their cities, reinforce Jerusalem's walls, and act like the cornered, exhausted enemy they were. What he never imagined was that Baldwin would ride out to meet him, leading a force so small it barely registered as a threat. And because Saladin didn't anticipate resistance, he allowed his army to relax, stretch across miles of terrain, and forage freely. Camps sprawled without discipline. Horse lines unraveled into clusters. Officers tended to logistics rather than readiness. The army wasn't arranged for war. It was arranged for victory celebrations. This overconfidence wasn't arrogance for its own sake. It was rooted in logic. When your scouts report Jerusalem is lightly defended and your enemy is led by a dying king, with barely 500 knights at his disposal, Why maintain a rigid battle formation? Yet it was in those moments of confidence, in the assumption that tomorrow's triumph was guaranteed, that cracks appeared. Cracks Baldwin would later pry wide open. For all Saladin's tactical brilliance, he misread one crucial truth. Desperate men don't behave logically. They don't retreat when they should, don't negotiate when they're outnumbered, and don't accept defeat when the world expects them to. Saladin saw a frail king. What he didn't see was a kingdom prepared to make its final stand. And so, as his army relaxed under the November sun, Saladin unknowingly set the stage for one of history's most astonishing reversals. A battlefield where numbers, experience, and rational strategy would all collapse beneath the weight of the unexpected. Jerusalem's throne room had witnessed centuries of royal debates, but none carried the suffocating dread that clung to the chamber in November of 1177. Word had arrived like a funeral bell. Saladin was marching north with an army so vast, it resembled a moving horizon. The city's nobles, commanders, clergy, and advisors gathered in a room thick with incense and fear, knowing that the fate of the kingdom rested on decisions made in that single meeting. Baldwin IV was carried in on a litter, his body too ravaged by leprosy to stand. Yet every eye turned to him with the desperation of drowning men watching a lifeboat. His hands, wrapped in silk to keep the skin from tearing, lay motionless. His face, hidden behind a silver mask, revealed nothing. What made the moment unbearable wasn't simply Saladin's numbers. It was the arithmetic of doom everyone in the room understood. Jerusalem had fewer than 1,000 defenders. The knights were scattered across distant fortresses. Reinforcements wouldn't arrive in time, and the kingdom's boy king was fighting not only an empire, but his own failing body. Raymond of Tripoli, a veteran commander who had fought more battles than Baldwin had lived years, urged the unthinkable: evacuation. My lord, he insisted gently, the kingdom needs its king more than its capital. Ride north to Tyre. Live today so we may fight tomorrow. Other nobles echoed him, voices trembling under the strain. Even the notoriously reckless Raymond of Chatillon said nothing. And for a man who had built his entire life on audacity, that silence was its own kind of omen. Some suggested negotiating terms, others sued for delay, and a few admitted what they feared most: that Jerusalem might already be lost, even before Saladin laid eyes on its walls. The air felt like it could crack under the weight of defeatism. The kingdom didn't need a miracle. It needed something even rarer, a decision no reasonable leader would make. Then Baldwin, through pain that would have paralyzed most grown men, asked to be lifted upright. The room stilled as his attendants propped him into a seated position. His voice, when he spoke, wasn't the frail whisper many expected. It was clear, steady, and carrying enough force to cut through panic like a blade. I may die tomorrow, he said, or in 10 years, but I will not die behind walls while my kingdom burns. The statement landed with the weight of prophecy. He reminded them that his disease, the very thing that should have ended his reign, had instead become the symbol of God's will if victory came. No man could claim it was due to strength, or numbers, or military advantage. It would be divine, undeniable, unforgettable. His words didn't merely counter fear, they inverted it. A dying king refusing escape shamed the healthy into courage. Odo de Saint Amand, Grand Master of the Knights Templar, knelt first, his warrior monks following suit like iron falling into place. If Baldwin would face annihilation, they would face it with him. The chamber transformed, not into a council of nobles, but a gathering of believers ready to gamble everything on the narrowest sliver of hope. And then Baldwin delivered the command that shattered every rule of military logic. They would not fortify Jerusalem. They would march out to meet Saladin. They would take 500 knights, a few thousand infantry, and attack an army 50 times their size. The decision was insane, suicidal, glorious, the kind of choice that either destroys kingdoms or forges legends. And as the council erupted into activity, Baldwin lay back on his litter, trembling from pain but victorious in spirit. The king who could barely hold a sword had just taken command of history itself. What followed Baldwin's impossible decision was not a march. It was a trial by fire. The order went out within the hour, and by sunset the Crusader host was already pushing south, heading straight toward the most feared army in the region. 500 knights and roughly 3,000 infantry began a 45-mile forced march under conditions that would have broken even well-rested soldiers. But these men weren't well-rested. They were already stretched thin from weeks of constant alerts, responding to raids, guarding borders, and shoring up defenses that were crumbling faster than stone could be quarried. And yet Baldwin demanded that they cover those 45 miles in barely a day and a half, an achievement even modern military historians struggle to comprehend. The November sun, instead of cooling the land, burned with unseasonable heat, turning armor into ovens and drying throats to rubber. Knights collapsed from dehydration, horses stumbled and foamed at the mouth, and men hallucinated from exhaustion. Still, no one dared slow. Templars took shifts carrying Baldwin's litter when the king passed out from pain, which happened often. At one point, near Ibelin, his body convulsed so violently it took multiple nights to restrain him. When consciousness returned, he didn't ask for water or rest. He simply whispered the same command every time: continue the march. This wasn't leadership through fear or authority. It was leadership through sheer, brutal example. The king, suffering more than any of them, was the one pushing hardest. And as impossible miles slipped behind them, something remarkable began to happen. The men stopped imagining doom and started believing in the chance, however faint, that they might change it. Meanwhile, every mile they covered tightened a noose that Saladin never realized was forming around his army. Because he believed the Crusaders were pinned in Jerusalem, he let his forces relax, fan out, and forage across 3 miles of countryside. It was an area small enough to be reasonable, yet enormous enough to be fatal. His troops loosened armor, watered horses at scattered pools, rummaged through villages, and grew complacent. They weren't in battle formation. They weren't even in marching formation. They were in victory formation, and that distinction would matter more than any number on parchment. As Baldwin's skeletal column approached, battered but unbroken, scouts returned with the first glimmer of hope the Crusaders had felt in weeks. The mighty Muslim host was unprepared. Supply trains lay unguarded. Wings of cavalry lounged far from their officers. The battlefield, if it could even be called that, was a sprawl of tents, horses, and scattered companies with no cohesion. For the exhausted Christian army, this news hit like a jolt of life. The impossible was not suddenly easy, but it had become possible. Baldwin, hearing the reports through heavy breaths and worsening pain, forced himself upright. His body was failing, but his mind was sharp enough to recognize what Saladin had overlooked: terrain. Beneath the seemingly flat plains lay ravines, natural traps that would punish a panicked retreat. He saw opportunity where others saw only open ground. And in that moment, the march that should have killed the Crusaders transformed into the very reason they would survive. Because in pushing themselves past the limits of endurance, Baldwin's men arrived before Saladin believed they could, and found an enemy sprawling, scattered, and disastrously unready. All Baldwin had to do now was commit the greatest gamble of his short, pain-ridden life. When dawn broke on November 25, 1177, the fields near Montgisard shimmered not with disciplined ranks of one of the world's most formidable armies, but with the loose, wandering sprawl of men who believed danger was days away. Saladin's forces, 26,000 strong, were stretched across miles of countryside, a patchwork of grazing horses, foraging parties, unguarded supply lines, and officers attending to administrative tasks rather than combat readiness. They had every reason to be relaxed. Their scouts had assured them that Baldwin's forces were weak and pinned behind Jerusalem's walls. The city, underdefended and terrified, seemed ripe for the taking. So when plumes of dust appeared on the northern horizon, Saladin didn't panic. He didn't even stand at first. According to chroniclers, he dismissed it as a minor raiding party, a nuisance at best. But as the dust grew thicker and the banners more visible, disbelief crept into the Sultan's voice. These weren't scouts. These were the war standards of Jerusalem, the golden crosses of the kingdom, the unmistakable red cross of the Templars, and worst of all, Baldwin's own royal banner. For a man famed for composure, Saladin experienced something rare: shock. He had never imagined Baldwin would dare leave Jerusalem, much less march across blistering terrain to confront him head-on. And it was this single miscalculation, not the clash of weapons, that truly marked the beginning of his defeat. The Crusaders, battered and half dead from the march, were somehow in formation, lances leveled, cavalry ranged in precise wedges, infantry prepared to strike. The sight should have been impossible, yet it stood before him like a prophecy already in motion. Saladin suddenly realized he had made a fatal assumption. He had expected logic, not desperation. And in warfare, desperation rewrites every rule. As frantic orders rippled through the Muslim camps, chaos erupted. Commanders scrambled to reassemble detachments, scattered across ravines and hills. Men rushed to tighten saddles, grab armor, find missing regiments. But 3 miles is an eternity in battlefield terms, and Baldwin wasn't interested in giving Saladin time to recover. His army, despite exhaustion, stood ready like a coiled spring. Baldwin himself, racked by pain and barely able to feel his hands, demanded to be lifted onto his horse and strapped into the saddle. Blood seeped through his bandages. The strain should have killed him, yet his voice carried with a resolve that electrified his men. He saw something Saladin had missed from afar, those ravines that cut invisibly through the plains, would turn any panicked retreat into a massacre. Terrain had chosen sides, and it wasn't favoring the larger army. So, at the very moment Saladin's forces were scrambling to form coherent lines, Baldwin raised his trembling, bandaged hand, a gesture that defied logic, pain, and the laws of probability. It was the signal his knights had been waiting for. What happened next became legend. 500 knights began to charge, not in fear, not in desperation, but with the full conviction of men who believed the impossible was already decided. Saladin watched as the Templar wedge angled perfectly toward the weakest point of his half-formed center. The Sultan finally understood his mistake. He hadn't lost the battle in combat. He'd lost it hours earlier when he let confidence lull his army into complacency. And as Baldwin's cavalry thundered forward, kicking up dust that turned the horizon into a storm, Saladin realized he wasn't witnessing the beginning of a fight, he was witnessing the beginning of a catastrophe. The moment Baldwin's trembling hand dropped, the battlefield transformed from tense anticipation into pure, explosive motion. 500 knights, their armor baking under the November sun, their horses running on the last fumes of strength, surged forward like a single living organism. At their tit rode the Templar wedge, 80 warrior monks whose discipline and ferocity had earned them a reputation that bordered on myth. They lowered their lances in perfect unison, forming a spear of iron, and will aim straight at the heart of Saladin's still-forming center. Muslim arrows darkened the sky, whizzing down like a storm of needles. Horses screamed. Men cried out, but the formation held. Every yard eaten up by hooves felt like defiance carved into the earth. And then the impact came. Chroniclers describe it as a sound like mountains colliding, a concussion that rippled through both armies. The front ranks of Saladin's elite Mamluks shattered under the force. Horses toppled. Men were lifted off the ground. Lances drove through mail, bone, and flesh as if reality itself had softened for the impossible to pass through. But the true shock wasn't the collision, it was what followed. Instead of pulling back to reform, the standard cavalry tactic, the Templars drove deeper, refusing to yield even an inch. They became a blade twisting inside the wound of Saladin's line. Behind them, Baldwin's remaining 400 knights smashed into the gap, widening it with terrifying efficiency. Suddenly, the math of the battlefield didn't matter. Men who had never run from battle flinched, faltered, and began to buckle under the onslaught. Saladin himself, watching from his command position, is said to have dropped his golden mace in disbelief. The Sultan, who had crushed armies twice this size, now stared in horror at the spectacle unfolding before him. 500 fanatics charging, as if they carried the weight of heaven behind them. But the collapse of his center was only the beginning, as the Templars carved through the Muslim ranks. The psychological shock rippled outward. Regiments on the left flank saw the devastation and began edging backward in confusion. That confusion twisted into fear when Baldwin's infantry, hidden moments earlier in dead ground, suddenly emerged on the flank, appearing like reinforcements summoned by divine intervention. From a distance, it looked as though fresh Crusader forces were materializing out of the hills, and panic doesn't bother checking headcounts. Shouts of "We are surrounded" ripped through the Muslim lines, a cry far more lethal than any sword. Horses began to rear, riders lost discipline, formations unraveled. Baldwin himself held his sword aloft, its glint visible even through the dust clouds. His hands, barely functional hours before, now clenched the hilt with a strength no chronicle can fully explain. Some said it was adrenaline, others said miracle. Whatever the truth, his presence pushed his men forward like a tide. At 50 yards, Muslim horses sensed the momentum shift and began backing away despite their riders' efforts. In seconds, retreat turned to rout, and behind them lay the traps Baldwin had foreseen, the ravines. What seemed like open plains had become funnels of death. Fleeing soldiers bottled up, collided, fell into chasms already clogged with bodies. The battlefield dissolved into a chaos no general could control. This wasn't simply a cavalry charge anymore. It was history breaking its own rules. 500 knights, exhausted, outnumbered, half dead, had done what military science declared impossible. They had broken an army 50 times their size. And as Saladin watched the collapse of his invincible host, he realized something chilling. The battle wasn't over. The slaughter had only just begun. What happened in the minutes after Saladin's center buckled was less a battle and more the unraveling of an entire war machine. Panic, once released, spreads faster than fire, and on the plains near Montgisard, it ignited like dry tinder. As the Templars tore deeper into the Muslim ranks and Baldwin's infantry appeared suddenly on the flank, the illusion of encirclement took hold. Men who moments earlier believed themselves invincible now felt the cold stab of doom in their stomachs. Saladin's officers shouted commands in Arabic, Kurdish, and Turkish, but their voices drowned in the roar of collapsing formations. Horses sensed the terror before men did. They reared, twisted, bolted sideways, smashing into comrades and scattering any semblance of coordinated defense. The left wing, seeing the center disintegrate, began edging backward, then retreating outright. What started as hesitation became a chain reaction of fear. But the true catastrophe erupted when fleeing soldiers reached the terrain. Baldwin had identified hours earlier. Ravines, deep, narrow, and invisible from a distance, cut across the landscape like traps laid by the earth itself. Men fleeing at full speed toppled into them by the dozens. Entire squadrons funneled into these chasms, piling atop one another until bodies formed accidental bridges. Those who tried to scramble out were dragged back by the weight of those falling behind them. Within minutes, natural depressions turned into charnel pits 20 feet deep. These ravines were supposed to be escape routes. Instead, they became the walls of a collapsing army's tomb. Saladin, watching the chaos from a hill, realized the truth no commander wants to face. His army wasn't merely losing, it was dissolving. His greatest fear came not from the enemy in front of him, but from the terror spreading through his own ranks. Then came the moment that ended all hope. Saladin's elite personal guard. 2,000 Mamluks bred from childhood to fear nothing but dishonor broke. These were warriors who had survived Byzantine cataphracts, Nubian cavalry, and Mongol raids. Men whose reputation alone had forced cities to surrender. And yet, faced with the relentless advance of Baldwin's knights, they fled. Some mounted their swiftest horses, others grabbed whatever riding animal they could find. Saladin himself, realizing his warhorse was too slow for escape, mounted a racing camel, a desperate choice chroniclers never forgot. The sight of the Sultan fleeing on a pack animal shattered the last remnants of morale. If the sword of Islam was running, what hope did anyone else have? Panic turned to full collapse, pursued by knights whose exhaustion seemed replaced by a terrifying second wind. Muslim soldiers ran for miles, only to be cut down in ravines, trampled in bottlenecks, or struck down as they tried to climb out of the carnage. Some dropped their weapons and tried to hide. Others begged for mercy that the momentum of battle could not afford them. Crusader knights, their blood up and their survival instincts sharpened to a razor edge, pursued with mechanical precision. Lances broke, swords bent, maces shattered, and still the killing continued. Even the horses fought like creatures possessed, biting and kicking in a frenzy of exhaustion and adrenaline. Chroniclers on both sides, Christian and Muslim, later described the pursuit as something beyond human, a slaughter powered by fury, fear, and the belief that divine judgment had descended upon the battlefield. By the time the sun began to fall, Saladin's mighty army, the force meant to end the Crusader states forever, no longer existed as an organized entity. It was a shattered remnant fleeing across the desert, while 20,000 of its warriors lay dead behind them. And for the first time in his life, Saladin tasted the bitter truth of vulnerability when the dust finally settled. The battlefield at Montgisard looked less like the site of a victory and more like the aftermath of a natural disaster, something violent and incomprehensible. As if the earth itself had decided to swallow an army. Bodies carpeted the landscape for miles. Ravines were choked with corpses stacked so densely that survivors later spoke of bridges made of the dead. The smell of blood, sweat, and broken armor hung in the air as Crusader knights staggered among the fallen, many so drained they could barely lift their visors. Their horses collapsed one by one, hearts strained beyond natural limits after hours of relentless pursuit. Even Baldwin's own mount finally buckled, trembling as attendants rushed to free the king from the straps that held him upright. When they lifted him to the ground, Baldwin collapsed immediately. Chroniclers describe blood seeping from beneath his silver mask, his wounds reopened, his nerves overwhelmed by agony. Several knights wept openly, believing their king might die before nightfall. Yet Baldwin, barely conscious, insisted on performing one last act before allowing himself to be tended to. Surrounded by men still shaking from exhaustion and shock, he commanded them to kneel. There, on that horrific field of death, amid 20,000 fallen enemies, Baldwin IV led his battered army in prayer. Non nobis Domini, not unto us, O Lord, but unto your name give the glory. The sight was surreal. 500 blood-soaked survivors bowing in reverence, while ravens circled overhead. To the Crusaders, it was gratitude. To the Muslim chroniclers who later recorded the scene, it was an omen. They believed Allah had turned his face away that day, allowing catastrophe to fall upon them. And perhaps the most astonishing part of Saladin's enormous army, fewer than 2,000 men saw the sunset. A force meant to conquer a kingdom had been annihilated in a single afternoon. Yet the victory, miraculous as it was, came with consequences that extended far beyond the battlefield. In material terms, the Crusader states suddenly found themselves wealthier than they had been in decades. Saladin's army had carried enough gold, weapons, and provisions to fuel a long invasion, all of which now fell into Christian hands. The Templars alone seized enough military equipment to refit nearly every fortress in the Levant. And most astonishingly, Saladin's war chest, literal tons of gold, became the financial lifeline of a kingdom that had been teetering on bankruptcy. For a brief, glittering moment, Jerusalem had resources, morale, and time. But the true cost of the battle was written in Baldwin's body. The young king survived the night, barely, but the effort had accelerated his decline. His physicians warned that his body had suffered more in one day than in the preceding year. Still, he continued to rule with sharp intellect and iron resolve, defying death for nearly 8 more years. Saladin, meanwhile, returned to Cairo humiliated and shaken. His authority cracked, alliances trembled, generals questioned his decisions. It took him a decade to rebuild an army comparable to the one lost at Montgisard. And yet, the irony at the heart of history remained cruel and sharp. Baldwin's miraculous victory bought the Crusader states time, but not salvation. 2 years after Baldwin's death, Saladin defeated the Crusaders at Hattin and reclaimed Jerusalem, a victory shaped in part by lessons he had learned on the fields of Montgisard. But for one impossible afternoon in 1177, numbers, logic, and destiny bent around a dying king and an army that refused to accept the world as it was. And the echoes of that victory would reverberate through Christian and Muslim memory for centuries. History often compresses battles into neat summaries. Who won? Who lost? How many died? But the legacy of Montgisard refuses to be contained in simple lines of text. It lingers like a shockwave, its impact felt across generations, cultures, and military traditions. For medieval Christendom, the victory became a rallying cry, an affirmation that courage and faith could overturn the practical realities of war. Church bells rang across Europe when news arrived, and sermons framed Baldwin's triumph as divine validation. For the Crusader presence in the Holy Land, recruitment for the military orders surged, castles were repaired, walls strengthened, and spirits revived. And for nearly a decade, the Crusader states enjoyed a reprieve they should never have had. But the battle's legacy extended far beyond material gains. It rewrote the psychological map of the Middle East. Saladin's legend, though eventually restored after his later victories, suffered a deep wound. The most powerful Muslim commander of the age had been driven to flee on a racing camel, leaving behind 20,000 dead. His enemies would never again underestimate him, but he would never again underestimate them either. Muslim chroniclers described Montgisard with horror, calling it a catastrophe permitted by God as punishment for complacency. Christian chroniclers, in contrast, elevated it to near myth, and caught between those interpretations was a single unchanging truth. 500 knights had shattered 26,000 warriors in one of the most improbable victories in military history. To this day, historians debate how such an imbalance turned into annihilation, terrain, morale, exhaustion, leadership, or something deeper, something not easily measured. Yet perhaps the most poignant legacy of Montgisard belongs to Baldwin IV himself, a king who should never have lived long enough to command an army, let alone defeat a titan like Saladin. His leprosy, a disease that should have silenced him, instead carved him into a symbol of defiant endurance. Muslim chroniclers respected him. Christian chroniclers revered him. Even Saladin, years later, reportedly said, "Of all the kings of the Franks, I feared him the most." And that fear wasn't rooted in numbers or resources, but in Baldwin's uncanny ability to inspire men to believe in the impossible. His leadership at Montgisard became a case study in morale as a force multiplier, still referenced by military historians today, when Winston Churchill praised the finest hour of soldiers. Standing against overwhelming odds, echoes of Montgisard resounded beneath the words. When stories of Thermopylae or O'Rourke's Drift stir admiration for hopeless stands that became legends, Montgisard belongs in that lineage. But unlike those famous last stands, Baldwin's was not a noble defeat. It was a miracle of victory, brief, brilliant, and ultimately unsustainable. 2 years after his death, the kingdom he saved crumbled at Hattin, and Jerusalem returned to Muslim control. And yet the shadow of Montgisard remains, a reminder that even the most rational predictions can fail, that armies can fall to fear faster than swords, and that sometimes a dying king can hold back the tide of history, if only for a moment. In the end, Montgisard stands not just as a battle, but as a testament to human will. The proof that courage, when pushed to its limits, can bend the world around it.